Hi everybody, welcome back to Brookside's Story. I'm Quin Schultze.
It's great to see you again, Quinn. I'm Pastor Paul, and I'm delighted that you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah, it's a blessing to be here with you again. I thought it would be great to talk about worship. I get around to a lot of churches. They seem to be doing worship differently. Mostly when I go out, what I see now is you sing a few songs, there's a sermon, and they might not call it a sermon, they'll call it a teaching, and then there's some more music, and bam, you're out the door.
Yeah.
They might not even do an offering. They may say they have little boxes out back or something, and that's it.
Yeah.
We're a little more complicated. Tell us what worship is like at Brookside.
I always think of worship as containing four chunks, four parts. You have the opening where you come into God's presence. You have the middle where you're conscious of God and your presence and some of the challenges of that. You have the sermon where we hear from the Lord, and then you have the response time.
And what holds all of that together?
It's a narrative of coming into God's presence and being before God and allowing God to speak to you and your opportunity to respond. It's a dialogue.
It's a dialogue. That's great. Communication. And with you in particular, what I notice is you're very good at having a theme that comes out of your sermon, and you're using that with all the different parts of the worship.
Again, I think some of us preachers are taught that your sermon needs to have a flow, a narrative, and I think that's true. But I like to think of all of worship as having a narrative. And I think what sometimes happens in worship is like it's the preliminaries, where you got certain songs in Scripture to read, depending on your tradition. And then you got the main teaching, and then you got to go.
So it's all about the sermon.
Yeah, which isn't a bad thing as a preaching pastor.
Yeah.
But I think worship itself tells a narrative, a dialogue between God and his people, from coming into his presence to being honest about your sin and receiving God's powerful forgiveness, as well as, what the sermon theme is.
So we have this thing of assurance, okay? We're assured in the gospel. And it's like a mini presentation of the gospel, even before we read Scripture.
Yeah. Often that middle section of worship would be known as a service of confession. I like to think of it, using your word, as a service of assurance. Mm-hmm. Most people know they're broken. They may not know they're sinful, but they know things aren't working the way they're supposed to. And so this is an opportunity to confess that a lot of that brokenness comes from me. Yeah, a fair amount comes from Quin, but Quin isn't really my problem.
Yeah.
I'm my problem. But God nevertheless wants me in his presence and welcomes me and has a healing word to speak to me.
So in this worship service at Brookside, we're going to get a sense of coming into God's presence, of our brokenness, of our sinfulness, of God's grace in healing us, redeeming us. We're going to hear a sermon, which is going to have a few more specifics about how then do we live, having been saved, right?
Right.
And then what happens after the sermon?
After the sermon, there's an opportunity to respond. So there's at least one song. Usually at Brookside, we sing 3 songs after the sermon. There's a response to give our gifts and our offerings to the Lord, or to a special ministry cause that we might be supporting. And we always leave with a final blessing from the Lord.
And that offering is part of the gratitude and response.
Exactly.
What God has given to us, and then we return.
Yes.
Say one last thing, Paul, if you would, about how you think week by week on putting together the whole service with a theme that comes from the Scripture for that Sunday.
Well, so if you have a theme from the Scripture, then you can think, how do we open this service in a way we're going to meet people where they're at, but also prepare them for where we're going in this narrative, right? There could be some big world, like this week, Sunday is on Christmas Eve while we're recording this, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious what the narrative is, right? An opening that doesn't acknowledge that would be just weird, right? Or like after 9/11, to use extreme examples, to just pretend that nothing has happened, or the start of World War II, go back in history, and you can probably, some of you can, the weekend of JFK's funeral, if you're old enough, I'm not, but
So
right?
there are natural things from the outside world that kind of pull us in.
But if you don't have that, you can, what's your theme? So what opening songs are going to already begin to draw us towards where Scripture is bringing us?
And then you're on, because you are the combination preaching pastor and the worship leader in one.
Yeah, in today's worship, that used to be pretty normal, right? The preaching pastor was also the worship pastor. It's less common today, although still common in many traditions. I think it gives us an opportunity, at least here at Brookside, to create this narrative flow. And we have lots of worship leaders. We have, when the choir is singing, what worship leadership is different than when we have a praise team or a praise band leading us. When the chamber ensemble is up there, it's different than when the brass is up there. So it depends on who's up there leading.
But they're all tied to that theme.
They're all tied to the theme, and then the pastor tries to hold it together.
Yeah.
And when you have other key worship leaders who are doing much of the worship leading, they're working hand in glove with the pastor, the preaching pastor of that Sunday to make it all flow.
They'll have meetings to try to. Right. But you're particularly gifted, Pastor Paul, at pulling these things together. In fact, it can become so natural that it's almost like, where did he come up with this? How did he put all that together? Did he write it all down? It does flow really well. I think Brookside is in a special spot, and the people who select the music do a spectacular job relating it to the theme of the worship. So I appreciate you having this conversation with me about worship. I hope it helps people a little bit to understand how we do things. I'd like to have a couple of conversations with you, too, about specific parts of worship.
Happy to do it.
Let's do that.
Yep.
Thanks, buddy. Blessings to you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate
everybody.
it.